The gloves are off. As promised, we are back with the latest update from the Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively legal saga. As we discussed in the last video, which if you haven't seen, I will link up here in the cards for you. We anticipated that this lawsuit would be filed, and here we are. I know it's not a brand new filing, but forgive me, I do have a life and obligations outside of YouTube. I can't always be on top of things right as soon as they drop. It's a different lawsuit with different defendants, which, in case you're wondering, this time include Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, their PR agent or Blake's PR agent, Leslie Sloane, and I believe her PR company, Vision PR. The causes of action include civil extortion, defamation, false light invasion of privacy, which I explained in my last video, basically portraying someone in a false light that is quite offensive to anyone, any reasonable individual in the plaintiff's shoes. Breach of implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing. Now this one's against Blake alone. Basically, she didn't act in good faith when she interfered with the production and maliciously took over, which is Justin's allegation. Intentional interference with contractual relations. This is against Blake and Ryan in particular with regards to WME, which was the talent agency the couple and Justin were both represented by. I believe WME has dropped Justin since. And finally, we have intentional and negligent interference with prospective economic advantage, strictly in relation to WME. And this is basically an argument that, but for Blake and Ryan's interference, then Justin would have probably benefited economically from that contract, which is obviously, you know, if you're with a talent agent, then they secure your deals and they help boost your profile. And with that, you would hope comes some moolah. I also want to mention before we get into the actual lawsuit that Justin is suing for $400 million. He's suing the New York Times for $250 million. So it's a hefty amount. This is big money coming into play. And I really do wonder if one of the parties are going to cave, give in, and settle. Obviously, it depends on not just the strength of their case, but their stubbornness. Because sometimes with parties, you know you have a weak case, or your lawyer rather has advised you have a weak case, and they advise you maybe to settle or seek a settlement. But some people just, they just get it in their head that they need to take it all the way. The filing starts off with a chronology of what happened, or what they allege has happened. Justin Baldoni and Wayfarer, the production company, purchased the rights to the book in 2019. They talk about how much the project has always meant to Justin and how they're always going to donate 1% of the proceeds to an organization called No More. And from what research I've done on Justin, he has a podcast talking about toxic masculinity and how to beat it. He seems to be quite passionate about these types of topics. And the reason this is being pointed out is to set the scene for what happens later. You might be surprised to learn that both Blake and Justin actually started off on a really high note. They seemed to get along quite well. We even have examples of early text messages that they exchanged, which seemed very friendly and, dare I say, a little bit risque. I suppose Blake Lively has a specific sense of humor, but it seems that they had good rapport. But then they allege that Blake starts to want to take control over the project almost immediately. She started off, I suppose, in the most predictable spot for a woman of her interests: fashion, the wardrobe.
My heel's being cropped out of there.
Don't crop out her heel.
They allege she completely wanted to revamp the wardrobe, made it ultra expensive. It went completely beyond the budget, and she made things logistically difficult. So she insisted on having fittings at her house. And as early as this point, she started to rewrite the script. Now, we all know here that the strongest allegations are always backed up with evidence. And so when it comes to these videos, I always try to point out evidence to back up a party's claim as often as possible. So in this instance, we have a text message here between producer and Jamie Heath, who is the other person that Blake is accusing of inappropriate sexual conduct on set. And they're complaining. They're complaining basically in April of 2023 how Justin can't just let her have opinions on everything, or she's going to end up co-directing this film. It didn't stop at the wardrobe, of course. We know that Blake also actually interestingly bragged on the red carpet about her husband Ryan Reynolds writing the rooftop scene, which nobody knew about until she said that on the red carpet. And there were some behind the scenes email exchanges between legal departments and Sony and Wayfarer, and there were concerns. They were alarmed again by this revelation because Ryan wasn't attached to the production at all. But early on, Blake made it seem as though she wrote it, and she really wanted to push that version of the scene on Justin. Eventually, because he wasn't really caving, he was like, I'm happy to take your opinions and your suggestions, but it's not necessarily going to be the version we run with. Eventually, this is where the whole Mother of Dragons thing comes in. She invites him over to her place where Ryan starts singing her praises, her writing abilities, and then someone who was unnamed, whom we now all are almost certain is Taylor Swift, because her team basically came out and said she had no idea it was a meeting. She just wanted to visit Blake. So it's basically confirmation that it was Taylor. Taylor just walks in and also starts singing Blake's praises. Forgive the pun when it comes to Taylor. I'm sure she wasn't actually singing. And Justin was like, okay, I see what's going on here. And so he sends Blake a text and he goes, listen, you don't have to, get your husband and your friend to convince me. I think the scene you wrote is great. And that's when she responds and says the following. If you ever get around to watching Game of Thrones, you'll appreciate that I'm Khaleesi, and like her, I happen to have a few dragons. For better or for worse, but usually for better. So, I don't know about you, but that for better or for worse line, I guess it was a hint of things to come. If you know anything about Blake's claims, one of them was that Justin Baldoni fat-shamed her and went as far as going behind her back and asking her trainer how much she weighs. Now, his version is that they have the same trainer. She actually introduced them, and he was training Justin for the role. And at one point, Justin asked for her weight because he had a very serious spinal injury that he had recovered from, and he needed to make sure how much he was lifting to stay safe. Now, what we didn't have in the New York Times lawsuit filing is this text message from Justin, which proves that he not only didn't fat shame her, but did quite the opposite. He says, I want you to know you will look amazing. Anything you are insecure about, we will talk through and get creative together and make you comfortable. I just don't want you to stress about your body. It's the last thing you need. At some point during the filming, and this was all still early 2023, before the whole hiatus for the Actors Guild strikes and the writer strikes and all that, Blake gave Justin an ultimatum. If he couldn't get on board with her work method, he had 2 weeks to recast her. Now, we know from that earlier text message we saw between the producer and Jamie Heath that Blake was already encroaching upon other people's roles and responsibilities and basically taking too much control over the production, way beyond what was agreed to in her contract of engagement, which, interestingly enough, from what I've learned in this lawsuit, she hadn't even signed by the time they started working on the movie. Wayfarer lawyers were chasing after her lawyers going, hey, can you send us a signed contract of engagement? And while you're at it, a signed nudity writer, because she hadn't signed that, apparently, according to Justin, before November 2023, when she came back with her 17-point list of demands, her return to productions document. But we'll get to that. I'm going to try to stick to the chronology here, even though it's a little bit difficult. When they started filming, they had already worked together for around 5 months. And we can see from text messages, again, provided as evidence, that Blake is just full of praise for Justin. So we can safely assume that during those 5 months of working together, writing scripts, rewriting, all of the pre-production, she didn't have any issues with his behavior. They also alleged that even now they were in the filming phase, they were no longer pre-production, Blake basically kept changing the script on a daily basis, which ruined the schedule, ruined the workflow, and affected the budget, naturally. Then we move on to the hiatus that the production was forced to go on due to the Hollywood strikes that took place in 2023. We're gonna fast forward to the fall of 2023 when Blake expresses her excitement at getting back to work. Now, this is incredibly important because right before the strikes ended, right before they were all due to come back to work, that is when her lawyers sent Wayfarer their 17-point list of conditions. Now, before we get to that though, something very telling and I believe very integral to how the rest of the story progresses took place during the hiatus. She started asking for more access to things that actors, which is what she was hired as basically, in addition to an executive producer, by the way, which is just something I learned from this lawsuit. It's a label that is given to a big star simply because they are a big star, but it doesn't actually make them a fully fledged producer. But Blake seemed to have missed the memo, according to Justin and his team, because she started pushing for access to dailies, which I had to look up the meaning of because obviously I'm not part of the film industry. It's basically raw, uncut footage. And she really pushed for these. You can see in those text messages, she was quite insistent. So first she tried with Justin. He went back to his team and went, oh boy, she's doing it again. She's doing exactly what she did with the whole writing thing. It starts off with, hey, can I just tweak a little bit here and there before she takes over the entire thing? And Justin basically could see this coming from a mile off, but he was quite diplomatic with her. You can see in those texts that the producers were saying absolutely not, don't give her access. And he's like, I'll try to see what I can do, maybe give her a little playlist, a little snippet to make her happy. And so that's what he ends up doing. He offers her a 5-hour playlist. He tells her it's too early for me to give you access to the footage that you're requesting, the dailies. But Blake isn't happy with that. As you can see from her response here, she goes, none of the other producers have had access to the dailies? Is it just you? So once again, she's testing the boundaries. That's actually a tactic I noticed she employs very frequently throughout this production, at least in terms of the text message evidence that I can see. Justin responds and says, listen, I'm just gonna give you one more thing. Otherwise, I'm not sending anything else to anyone. So he does appear to put his foot down. Now, this is important because what happens next may be an indication of how badly Blake took this rejection. It was probably a rejection to her, in her mind. Now, if you look at the date of this text message where Justin basically told her no, it was the 25th of August. The SAG-AFTRA strike ended on the 9th of November. And that was basically when they were due to come back to work. But instead, as per their complaint, they were met with an email from Lively's lawyer, who sent Wayfarer an unsettling and unexpected 17-point list of non-negotiable conditions that must be met before Lively would return to work. Now, both Wayfarer and Sony asked to revise these non-negotiable points because they wanted to make them more factually accurate. But the lawyers responded and said, sorry, this isn't open for negotiation. You either sign or you lose your main star. Now, I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure out that Blake was the powerhouse in this dynamic and Justin was the underdog. And so they signed, and they explain here that they did so because the alternative was to lose millions of dollars, cost hundreds of people their jobs, and destroy their relationship with Sony. And after all, some of the demands were agreeable. Indeed, some were already in place. And we've talked about this in the first video I made on this topic, such as the presence of an intimacy coordinator. There already was one. We discussed this point where Blake didn't even want to meet them. I showed text messages from Justin Baldoni's side to prove this claim. I also played a clip from an interview with Blake where she was promoting the movie and she said there was an intimacy coordinator. She confirms this. Now, you could argue, playing devil's advocate, that she was referring to an intimacy coordinator that was hired after her demand. But again, Justin has produced evidence that shows that he picked one, he really likes them, and he wanted them to meet up with Blake, but she refused. And so what ended up happening was Justin would meet them by himself and come back with notes. and this is new to me in this lawsuit, she allegedly rejected all the intimacy coordinator's proposals and rewrote the scenes herself. Now, this is important again because one of her major claims is that she was uncomfortable during these sex scenes or nudity scenes, and Justin improvised, basically talking to her as Justin Baldoni and making her feel uncomfortable. On that point of improvisation, according to Justin's team, Blake was actually the one who was breaking character and improvising scenes. Now, Blake's team have actually hit back with a statement regarding the release of this footage, and this is what they had to say. Justin Baldoni and his lawyer may hope that this latest stunt will get ahead of the damaging evidence against him, but the video itself is damning. The video shows Mr. Baldoni repeatedly leaning in towards Miss Lively, attempting to kiss her, kissing her forehead, rubbing his face and mouth against her neck, flicking her lip with his thumb, caressing her, telling her how good she smells, and talking with her out of character. Every moment of this was improvised by Mr. Baldoni with no discussion or consent in advance and no intimacy coordinator present. And they end the statement by saying that releasing this footage is an unethical attempt to manipulate the public. And Blake didn't stop there, by the way. She has also filed for a gag order against Justin's lawyer, Brian Friedman, to stop him from giving interviews, leaking footage, and making public statements about this case. This really reminds me of Amber Heard having issues with Johnny's lawyer, who was also doing the rounds, leaking recorded conversations between them. And unfortunately for Johnny, in the end, Adam's involvement did end up getting him in trouble, hence Amber's countersuit for defamation. What do you think? Should Brian sit this one out and just keep hush until we get to trial? Or should he keep doing what he's doing? Some would argue that if this footage corroborates Blake's version, then she shouldn't be worried about the footage making it in the public domain. And some would say, I think we should reserve this for the courtroom. She also insisted on a nudity rider when filming nude scenes. Now, what's interesting is that she was sent one, and this was sent on May 8th of 2023, and they asked that it please be signed by the next day. Turns out, though, that Blake basically didn't sign it for at least a very long time. I believe at least until November, when she sent her list of demands. So it's very confusing. Suddenly, things stop making sense when you hear that she insisted on nudity riders when she didn't even sign the one sent to her in May, so 6 months prior to her list of demands. There's also the fact that apart from the birthing scene, which she had apparently written and called action for, there weren't any scenes filmed involving nudity before November, before the strikes had ended. Because that one scene that she wrote, as I said, she basically co-directed. She alleged she had nothing but a little piece of thin material to cover her genitals, but it turns out she was wearing black briefs, a pregnancy suit to cover her midsection, and then the hospital gown to cover her top, which can be proved, they say, by footage. In terms of the porn, Blake had said she never watched it. Justin basically applauded her and said it's horrible. He was exposed to it at a very early age when he was only 10, and he suffered from an addiction, and he has been very vocal about this addiction on his podcast, and he's known to talk about the perils of porn. So again, we're getting a lot of context here that we didn't get when reading through Blake's filings. There are a few points I'm gonna skip because I've already gone through them in quite a bit of detail in my last video, such as entering the trailer while she's in a state of quote-unquote undress. So because we've already covered that, I'm going to move on to the blackmail. From the previous filings, both Blake's and Justin's, we know that there was an all-hands meeting that was called on the 4th of January 2024. So this was after the 17 demands were agreed to by Wayfarer. Now this is the meeting where Blake alleges a 30-point list of demands was drawn up, to which Wayfarer agreed. We discussed in the last video that they in fact never saw that document, and the first time they ever saw it was in Blake's filing her complaint with the California Department of Civil Rights. So they had only agreed to the 17-point list, but not the 30-point list. And if you want to know the importance of that distinction, then just go ahead and watch my first video, because we talk about that too. From what I understand in the lawsuit, that meeting was also used as yet another extortion tactic for basically threatening, if you want me to come back and if you want me to promote this film, then you'd better agree to all these conditions. And the way Justin interpreted it is basically, she wants control. She wants control over the movie. She is basically stealing it from right under my fingers. And there's nothing I can do. You can see his despair actually in this email, which was sent before this hands-on meeting. So he was already on to what he believed were her intentions during the holidays in 2023. He says, I have come to terms with the fact that the only way out is through. I am waving the white flag and submitting. I am going to give her 98% of what she wants. I'm sure none of us have the energy to fight anymore. And so this is the section that I actually called hostile takeover in my notes, because I felt it was the most appropriate summation based on what they allege happened. Blake started threatening Sony, so she bypassed Wayfarer, that she wouldn't promote the movie if she's not allowed to make her own cut, her own edit of the movie. There's also a text message between Sony execs and Jamie Heath, basically telling them, you need to go along with what Blake wants. And she basically shut out Justin and his team to the point where they never saw her cut. They never saw the version that was being shown to audiences alongside his cut, which, by the way, he was the director. So obviously you're going to have a director's cut. There's a text message that confirms this with an editor saying, I've just been told that we're not permitted to look. And Justin goes, the editors and director aren't allowed to look at an actress's cut. Got it. Well, here we go. Funnily enough, the audience reacted a lot better to Justin's version. And so eventually, after much convincing from Sony executives, Blake agreed to incorporate his version into hers, because initially she just wanted her cut to go. Then they allege that she had removed Justin from all promotional material, all posters, and she had banned him from interviews and showings, screenings, I suppose is what they're called, basically icing him out of the promotional campaign. And then she pushes for a Producer Guild of America mark, which is apparently very prestigious, and you have to actually be a producer and earn it. It's not something that just gets slapped on like executive producer. She threatened that she wouldn't promote the film if she didn't get it. And so Jamie and Wayfarer basically write an email of recommendation to the Producers Guild of America recommending Blake for the mark. You can even see an email from Jamie clearly stating that they only did this under duress. We all heard about the pettiness of unfollowing on social media. So Blake and the cast members and even Colleen Hoover, the author, all unfollowed Justin Baldoni. People noticed, and Justin's side argued that this was done on purpose, basically feeding the public breadcrumbs, as they called it, to get them to start speculating. And of course, in this instance, speculating against Justin Baldoni. We all know from real life that it actually ended up working. People were curious as to why Justin was doing a whole separate promotional tour to the rest of the cast, and people started wondering whether he was the problematic one because he was the odd one out. Justin's side also claimed that Ryan Reynolds had allegedly told WME to drop Justin and that he was a sexual predator. At this point, Justin recruited a crisis PR team headed by Melissa Nathan. Part of this alleged smear campaign against Justin was banning him from the premiere, which he then managed to convince Blake through executives, not directly of course, to let him attend, but under the condition that they're completely separate, they're never on the carpet at the same time, and Justin had to come up with this last minute basement screening, separate from the actual screening where Blake and Ryan were, which Wayfarer had paid for, by the way. So they had to have a double expense of paying for the one that Blake was allowed to attend and the one that Justin had to attend with his friends and family. And this extended to the after party as well. We can also see photos from this basement gathering that have been attached as evidence. We also learn how Blake may have received or accessed the text messages that were exchanged between Justin's PR team, Jessica Abel and Melissa Nathan. We went through those text messages in the first video, and we were informed as the public by Blake's legal team that they were retrieved via subpoena, which is the normal course of doing things. However, we have been given an alternate version, which involves Wayfarer's ex-PR agent, Stephanie Jones. Now, Jessica Abel, who still works for Justin and Wayfarer, was an employee of Stephanie's. She quit when Stephanie allegedly started having severe mental issues that made her impossible to work with. The thing is, though, Jessica's number was her personal number that she'd had since high school, and so she asked for the number to be released. So she'll give back the work phone, but give me back my number. Long story short, Jessica was called into the office and was asked to hand over all her things. There was a lawyer there to scare her, and she was so terrified out of her mind and shocked that she disassociated and ended up signing whatever releases and documents they asked her to sign, which included handing over her phone. And so she didn't get access to her number for a while until it was eventually released, but not before Stephanie had allegedly read out all text messages to Jessica's ex-coworkers. And we know this from a text where she says, "Hey, I've always liked you guys. I don't know what she said about me, but I've always thought highly of you." And an employee actually responds and says, "Yeah, that's not what your texts say. It's not what your phone says about you." So there is your, I suppose, hint. I mean, it's a strong hint that her phone had been looked into. Justin's team is arguing that that is exactly how Blake had access to all of these texts, because Stephanie was out for blood. She wanted revenge for being let go because everyone was dropping her, including her high-profile clients. And so to exact her revenge, they claim she sided with Blake and offered her all this evidence, I suppose. The final chapter involves more alleged blackmail. You're starting to understand, I'm sure, where the first cause of action, extortion, comes into play. After the whole backlash against Blake for her inappropriate way of promoting the movie, Blake and Ryan had allegedly still refused to accept blame and had, through WME, which was still representing Justin at that time, demanded a public apology or else, or as they said, the gloves will come off. And when Justin and Wayfarer asked, well, apologize for what? They doubled down and basically said, well, for all this negativity. You have to say it's basically your fault. You have to say that things did not go well during the production process. If these executives sit there on the stand and say that no one pushes back on Lively and Reynolds, or the fact that the executive admitted that Lively and Reynolds brought the backlash on themselves, but that they were beyond reasoning with. He also admitted that making constant threats was Lively and Reynolds' well-known modus operandi, and that their demands were not based on reality, but on finding someone to blame for their social media crisis besides themselves. These are really explosive statements to be made by, I suppose, an independent third party who has no skin in the game necessarily. And if they can sit there and verify this hearsay, because this is hearsay as it stands, it's not strong evidence. Oh, someone told me so and so. Anyone can walk up and do that. Anyone can lie and do that. So if anyone's frustrated out there and going, oh, this is so annoying, why do they have to come verify, or why is it hearsay? Because how do we know it's true? We need these checks and balances in a court of law. Trust me, you don't want to do away with them. Finally, the lawsuit touches upon the whole smear campaign that was orchestrated by Blake in collusion, as they allege, with the New York Times. And we've been through all of those allegations in the last video because that was the lawsuit we were looking at, the initial filing against the New York Times. So we're not going to do that again today. Here's their theory of the case. Basically a summary of what they're arguing and what they want the jury to believe. Lively used her power to steal a movie from its director and production studio. Then she held them hostage to her incessant demands by extortionate threats to destroy what they had left. All the while, she failed to understand the heart and soul of the movie she stole and the book it was based on, let alone the intensely personal impact the book had on millions worldwide. When her thoughtless promotions fell flat because they focused on flowery glamour and cross-merchandising opportunities for her own brands, rather than on centering the voices of survivors, she finally got a taste of accountability, and she did not care for it. She made one final demand to plaintiffs, that they finally and forever fall on the sword for her by apologizing for things they had not done, killing their future prospects in the process. When they refused, defendants' gloves came off, and they used their power and resources to try to take down plaintiffs for good by coordinating with Jones and Sloane, master practitioners of the dark arts of public relations, in an intricately planned character assassination plot. They nearly pulled it off too. So, it's early days. We cannot base our opinions on what each party says, because when it comes to lawsuits, especially civil ones, especially this early on, it is still at the point of he said, she said. Granted, Justin's side does have more solid evidence. I said this in my last video. So far, Blake's evidence is weak. It has been proven to be cherry-picked, and I'm not swayed. So if we were at a trial right now, and the standard of proof in a civil case is on the balance of probabilities in the UK and Australia, which is where I am, it's the same thing in the US. It's just called the preponderance of the evidence. So basically, a slight tip of the scale. You just have to be at least 51% convinced that one side is telling the truth or not. And as it stands, my scale is tipped in Justin Baldoni's favor. Wouldn't have known him from a bar of soap before this case. I have no bias. I don't hate Blake Lively. Don't know anything about her either. But Justin is pulling up, as the kids call it nowadays, the receipts. So that's it for today. Let me know what you all think so far, and I'll see you in the next one.